All right, we're in. So remember, we're live now. Don't text him either. I want to open with this quote from Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was a great historian. This is one of the quotes. We were not born critical of existing society. There was a moment in our lives, or a month or a year, when certain facts appeared before us, startled us, and then caused us to question beliefs that were strongly fixed in our consciousness, embedded there by years of family prejudices, orthodox schooling, imbibing of newspapers, radio, and television. This would seem to lead to a simple conclusion, that we all have an enormous responsibility to bring to the attention of others information they do not have, which has the potential of causing them to rethink long-held ideas. A question I once asked him on the 500th anniversary of Columbus at the U of O, where he was speaking. And I said, because he was basically, it's not that I've had the need to defend Columbus, really, but I asked him, what's the nicest thing you could say about Columbus and his legacy? And he said that there's been 500 years of resistance. That's the nicest thing? Okay.
You got me going on this guy because he's my favorite historian of all times. Harvard.
Yeah.
Head of the Harvard History Department. Wrote People's History of the United States.
Yes.
Which is a must-read book for anybody who wants to have a conscience. He said that there is no law passed in the history of the United States that wasn't for the sole purpose of protecting rich people's money.
Ouch. Well, that leads right into what I'm talking about.
Okay. Segue.
Ouch. All right. You can't break the rules until you know how to play the game. So you have to know what the rules are, because the rules are going to be predictive of what transpires next. All right? So what Howard said in studying the Constitution, or constitutions in general, basically it does set down the rules, but it also means that there's some unwritten rules, which is what you should also be paying attention to as well. So you can't break the rules until you know how to play the game, especially the conditions which regulate fair play, a level playing field, boundaries, all the pieces, if we're referring to chess, players, positions. Okay? Then you can bend, break, or otherwise alter play, or at least predict in what ways your opponent is going to cheat. All right? So, what if you want to advantage some secretly while seeming to provide fair play for all? That would be a question. Oh, well, if it's liberty and justice for all and everybody's equal because we don't have royalty in America, well, how do you preserve certain people getting advantages that other people don't? So, in fact, we do have a form of royalty in a sense. Not that I would consider Donald Trump royalty, exactly, but he was born into money. So other people were born into money. You know, Beyonce and Jay-Z's kid, born into money, but they didn't come from money. So what kind of legacy is that? All right? So, how would you do it? All right? You publicly say no racial preferences while secretly making sure the dominant preference is white. Now you can shift that around from country to country, right? But we're talking here. And that's part of what Howard Zinn is talking about. What's enshrined in the Constitution, and then what follows. Every civil rights legislation, right, does not upset the dominant paradigm. Does not. Cannot. So it will be interesting to see what happens when the demographic of this country shifts from majority minority, or where whites are in the minority. because in some places they are already. What will happen to the power structure? Will we have a new white people?
2040.
Yeah, maybe sooner than that, though. Yeah, but that's what they projected. So, knowing that the rules give racial preference. Okay? Old school parents, that is old school black parents, since this is an African American experience class, teach their kids the advantage, right? And I've said this before, you've heard me say this many times. You have to be functionally, that is practically and actually, twice as good as a white man to be considered equal. In terms of, if we express that algebraically, so that means if the job requires a white man to know X, you must know 2x plus y. That's why I've expressed that as a algebraic equation. That's what has to be to mending. You know, I was in a training this morning with some of our admins, and you know, they were joking because you know, administrative assistants tend to be women, not always, but they tend to be women, and they're not called secretaries anymore because that isn't even remotely what they do anymore. They coordinate information flows, and they said, you know, the reason they call them man hours is because it takes a woman 20 minutes. Ooh. So, the movie, I think this is on the list, if you've seen the movie Aquila and the Bee. But if you haven't, check it out, right? So, that is a real world thing. I mean, I've met people like Lawrence Fishburne's character. I mean, he's teaching at UCLA, so I know people like that. I was raised by people like that. Basically, in terms of looking at, and this is the standard reference that I have, in terms of like a dictionary. Get thee to a dictionary. Learn how to spell without spell check. Learn the different variations of the word origins, how the word changed from what it used to be to what it is now, and how will it mutate later? What are some of the new terminology? All right? So in order to use the power of language, you cannot simply know words, vocabulary, spelling, and usage. You can't. The means of power basically are often invisible, right? So you need definition, language of origin, and all possible meanings, especially where culture may change those meanings. So for example, racial code words, or also the code words of discrimination. All right, so that's why, for example, in Aquila the Bee, that's a great training ground for looking at, okay, look up the word. Can I ask what language it's from? Because that'll give you spelling, and it'll also give you where it came from in terms of their meaning. All right, so when I talk about, for example, loving your enemies, all right, if you use an English definition of love, that doesn't make sense. Right? So when I return to the Aramaic, the African origins of that word, loving your enemy doesn't mean hugging your enemy and turning the other cheek. It means that you have to see into your enemy's heart to see how they tick, so that their actions become predictable and that you don't have to be a victim of their predictable actions against you. That means you have to know your own heart, you have to know their heart, and everything they might do. Because sometimes your enemy is your closest friend. How do people betray you? How might they betray you?
Sun Tzu.
Sun Tzu, right, Art of War. There's a word, there's a book actually, this is from a book called They Have a Word for It, which is basically difficult to translate words into English, or more specifically, words in another language that they have a word for that we don't have a word for it in English. So moquita is a thing that everybody knows and nobody talks about directly. In fact, to talk about it directly in the home culture might have deadly consequences. So if you're going to talk about it, you have to talk about it either in code or indirectly. So for example, the reality of HIV infection and AIDS in a singles bar. Everybody knows about that, but not necessarily everybody might practice safer sex, which is from the point of view of sexually transmitted infection. Point of view means you know the infection status of anybody you're about to have sex with beyond having barrier methods. Yes, you have barrier methods, but you also know the infection status of whoever you're having sex with up front. Verifiable, scientific. Not just get loaded and knock boots. Before you get loaded and knock boots, well, first, maybe you shouldn't be getting loaded. Maybe you should, find out all that stuff before you get loaded so that, make sure that, because it's not just about, if you're heterosexual, getting pregnant or getting somebody else pregnant. It's not about that. Right? What they used to say before Barack Obama, black presidential candidates are quote unquote unelectable. What do they mean by that? And what happens when that changes and how it changes, which is something we'll be looking at when we get to the 21st century, because right now we're in the 60s, 50s and 60s. So, black presidential candidates are unelectable. So, white privilege in affirmative action. Is something that everybody knows but nobody talks about, right? So, for example, the logic within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. All men are created equal, but the underlying message is white men are superior to all. That's written into the Constitution. Not explicitly, all men are created equal, but Thomas Jefferson is not talking about all human beings. And he's not talking about all people of the male gender either, being citizens.
All white men are created equal?
By implication, yes.
Only property owners can vote.
Only property owners can vote, and that native nations are not in the Constitution, even though they're present. Women are not present in the Constitution when he's writing that. So the default setting, and when you define black people as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of apportioning representation, but they are not represented, only their owners are represented, you're basically saying white men are superior to all. Okay? So back to slide, please. Also, there's really way down in the audio, it sounds like you're playing the intro music, so you might want to mute that, perhaps. Congress shall devise no remedy for past discrimination that seriously or substantially undermines or affects white systemic advantages. Now, that's not written, but that's effectively the case. Every civil rights legislation basically follows that rule. We're not going to give rights to other people and diminish the advantages of who we consider citizens, originally, who the founding fathers considered citizens, right? When the law refers to past discrimination, automatically in English they're saying that, it's past discrimination. But not necessarily that that discrimination is going on now, or that that discrimination has changed form and has been upgraded and updated. It's past discrimination. So, because it's past, look, you got a black president now. Racism is over. Okay? So current discrimination, the way it's working now, attacks the remedies for past discrimination by casting the remedies as unfair, even though practically the remedies have not produced equity. Okay? They have not ended discrimination. And if we basically use proof for doing that, well, let's define equity first. So equity, according to the dictionary, actions, treatment of others, or a general condition characterized by justice, fairness, and impartiality. The system of jurisprudence, that's supplements common and statutory law, when those bodies of law are inadequate in the attainment of justice. Justice applied in conformity with the law, but influenced by at the same time by principles of ethics and fair play. A claim that is judged to be just and fair. The value of a piece of property over and above any mortgage and other liabilities relating to it. So all the different senses of equity. The ones I want to focus on in this particular case, right? The system of jurisprudence that supplements common and statutory law. So common law dates back to English law, where the king basically ruled y'all, and y'all were property. Literally, property. The king had the right to sleep with your wife on your wedding night. If you needed movie evidence of this, Braveheart. First rights nights. First night's
Prima
rights.
nocte.
Huh?
I think you said prima nocte.
Yeah, right. First night, right. Justice applied in conformity with the law, but influenced at the same time by principles of ethics and fair play, or also the opposite. That is, the law may prevent discrimination, but that doesn't prevent discrimination from happening, either inside or outside of the law. So when those bodies of law are inadequate in the attainment of justice. So the law recognizes fighting words. I can't be called, well, since this is my class, I can say it. I can't be called nigger in a federal workplace legally. Right? Can't be. Fighting words. It's protected. That kind of speech is against the law and is not protected. People are not exercising their free speech by calling me that name because it's prohibited by law. That means they can call me all kinds of other things that may or may not be recognized, right? So the shift is predictable. You outlaw one thing, then people ain't dumb enough to say, oh, well, you know, they're a nigger. They'll refer to, oh, it's a tar baby. And then they can go to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia say, oh, well, yeah, there are only some people that say that tar baby is an ethnic slur, and they quote the New Republic. Otherwise, it's just a historical story. Well, I didn't really mean anything ethnic by it. It's this person is in a sticky situation, and they keep coming back to us. Yeah. I didn't even know they were black. Yeah, okay. So, affirmative action is a racial code word. Okay? So, when you're in, like LCC, when you're an equal opportunity employer, doesn't mean that you simply give the same numerical chance to apply for a position. It also means you have a duty to not secretly discriminate, using the usual means, which is nepotism, for example, hiring your friends, your family, their friends, their family, when they're not qualified. Special insider knowledge. Here's how you apply for this position. Here are the words that you have to say, things you have to put on your resume to qualify. Giving special advantage to internal applicants. The reason I'm mentioning this is because since this is being broadcast from Lane Community College, at some point, this institution in the past has done all these things. As we were talking about Monday, right? If nationally, in the local hiring area, 10% of college professors are black, then there should have been 25 black professors at Lane Community College when the first study was first done in 1992. Not 2. because the data was showing people are applying, they're just not getting hired. Do we have a preference for people who go to the U of O, who basically, again, same hiring area? But has the U of O ever had more than 4 black professors at any given time? Or 5? Certainly not 7. And who could tell you that if you asked the question? Right. Right. So, I can answer that here. Not necessarily my HR department. Because they don't, before 1992, records weren't kept on race and ethnicity. Which is in itself illegal.
How many professors are there at U of O? Approximately.
That's a known figure.
Oh.
Must be.
You
I don't know.
Must be a couple hundred.
Yeah, potentially a couple of hundred with adjuncts. You know, there's different levels of what a professor is, right?
So if you got
Or
11%
yeah,
black
teacher
people,
or whatever.
Yeah.
And you're saying right now there's no more than 4?
Unless just the ones that I know that are visible.
well, they don't have Derek Bell anymore.
They don't have Derek Bell anymore, but he wasn't technically a professor, right? So,
Well, a teacher.
Yeah.
Okay.
so you know, Yvette Asenso and her husband. A couple of people in ethnic studies. Anybody else? I mean, that's just the African American ones. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have black staff. You know, football team,
Head of the creative
Yeah.
writing
Yeah.
department's black man.
Just straight teachers.
And who you know?
creative writing. Okay, all right. We're getting up there.
Okay.
5, right? But nowhere near 10%.
And that's what the law state affirmative action is? 10%?
It is whatever your local hiring area is. And if Lane Community College's local hiring area, because we're in alignment with the U of O, is the nation, then that's what you measure from. Not Oregon or not Eugene. The nation.
What were you saying Monday about it has to be, if there's a tie between 2 qualified applicants, then the person that.
I'll show you.
because
I'll show you.
That,
Right?
that was the way to get out of it.
Okay? So, your duty within affirmative action, if you're an equal opportunity employer, the equal opportunity is not you can apply and you can apply and you can apply. It's not an equal opportunity. It also means that you are not secretly discriminating too. Simultaneously. Okay, so when affirmative action is a racial code word, it refers to the assumption that an unqualified minority is taking the place of an assumed fully qualified white person. Generally, it assumes that standards have been lowered to fill a racial quota. Quota is itself a racial code word relating to affirmative action. No one protests when an unqualified white man is promoted to a position over a minority with greater qualifications. Okay, so it's assuming, oh, well, there's quotas. You're lowering standards. There's a piece on NPR this morning. Michelle Martin has her race cards where you basically send in a card with 6 words. And this black doctor, Ivy League trained black doctor he's working emergency room in North Carolina. He says, no black man can exceed 55 miles an hour. So he's talking about his experience. No matter how qualified he is, there are certain things that he cannot say or do. And he's actually generated complaints from patients, well, some patients who won't see him because he's a black physician. Well, it's North Carolina, right? And not that does happen in Eugene, that does happen in Sacred Heart. Happens lots of places, right?
Sure does.
So he's talking about how he's actually had to slow down and take more time with patients. Like 20 minutes to half an hour, which if you've been to a physician lately, that's unprecedented because the insurance companies want you to spend no more than 10 or 15 minutes with a patient.
Sure do, boy.
right? So he got a complaint because one of his patients said that he was uppity. So, well, what does that mean? Am I using medical terminology to describe your medical condition? Am I using words that is above your vocabulary? Well, let's see, I'm trained at Harvard and Columbia and went to UConn. How am I supposed to talk to you from North Carolina? You know? So, racial code word, right? No one protests when an unqualified white man is promoted to a position over a minority with greater qualifications. Right? The assumption with affirmative action is, oh, well, you got your job because of affirmative action. Well, I know I didn't. Okay? So the quota is actually a representative numerical goal or target, which is either the equivalent number in population. That is, here's what the quota is. You define your local hiring area, and the actual people working in the population at that time is your goal if your workforce is less than that. Okay, so if you wanted to recruit, if you were, the phraseology is underutilized. Okay, so if the U of O and Lane Community College were underutilized for black faculty, which they both are, then they can set a goal of 10%. So if we have, say, for example, 4 black faculty here at Lane Community College, we could look at our hiring processes and work towards a goal of adding 20 more. But that's at the administrative level. The faculty doesn't want to do that. And you can see why. Because who's making the hiring decisions? I haven't made any enemies. I've always been saying that. So I just say to my colleagues, prove me wrong. I've sat in your hiring processes. I've seen this. All right, so quota, representative numerical goal or target. Actual number of people working. It's not an arbitrary figure. It comes from a real number. And all you have to be doing is basically making a good faith effort. That's all. And demonstrate that numerically. All right? So, affirmative action is a weak remedy for a persistent problem. That is, the refusal to perceive and utilize talent in any package other than white or white male that presents itself. That's all. And this is the basic DNA from, the Constitution, right? Preferences in hiring by race are nothing new in America. Whether presidential selections, corporate CEO selections, the preference has been and remains white, heterosexual, male, Protestant. And basically look at the numbers in the Fortune 500. Things have changed, but substantially. All right, so when they were saying that black presidential candidates are unelectable and they're talking like Jesse Jackson, well, what happens when you have a black Harvard graduate, lawyer, senator, et cetera, et cetera?
Head of the Yale Law Review.
Head of the Yale Law Review, all those kind of things, right? What are presidential qualifications? So, affirmative action policies have been used to desegregate, integrate, diversify higher education student bodies as well as faculty and staff where there have been and remain persistent patterns of discrimination. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this affects you, no matter who you are, because eventually affirmative action applies to you. If you're 40 plus, if you're disabled, if you're a veteran, not just an ethnic minority or a woman. Eventually, it covers everybody, because everybody eventually gets discriminated against, one way or the other. All right, so affirmative action, of course, basically doesn't apply to preferences based on wealth, family, that is legacy, alumni status, and other entitlements such as sports scholarships, all those remain intact and unchallenged. Now, when you look at the academic performance of minorities that are admitted to schools and the legacy admits, that is, your daddy bought the building, but you're not academically qualified. Minorities, they're comparable. They perform at or above the level of legacy admits, particularly if they're George W. Bush. You know I was going to go there, right? I mean, C- average in Yale. How do you do that?
He never went.
Or he's drunk or whatever, but yeah.
He never went.
So, here's by the numbers. The largest beneficiaries of the benefits of affirmative action policies are white women. That remains true to this day. In college admissions, affirmative action policies have never, notice that in shouty, bold, underlined text, never actually racially diversified the student body of any predominantly white college or university beyond 10% total in the country. And for example, in the instance of Michigan's law school, minority admits for one term, one semester, pushed that up to 10% before people protested that. And that was just in the law school at that one college. Okay, so affirmative action in terms of college admissions is not effective for diversifying the student body by the numbers. In fact, for example, many of the cases brought to court, for example, Bakke, two curious facts emerge. Less qualified white applicants were accepted ahead of and instead of the plaintiffs, with sometimes greater numbers, but the lawsuit was against minorities only. This is true in Bakke's case. He was suing because minorities were admitted ahead of him, but less qualified whites in greater numbers were admitted ahead of him too. But the lawsuit wasn't against them, just the minorities. So by implication, he's saying, oh, well, white people get a pass. Okay, the case for so-called reverse discrimination. Because you hear people say, oh, reverse discrimination, reverse racism, reverse discrimination. Where, okay, this is what this means legally, where a less qualified minority applicant was illegally, remember this is illegal to do this, was illegally hired over a more qualified white applicant. The cases have been proven to be true 3% of the time. So 97% of those cases are untrue. Reverse discrimination barely exists. When you define it this way. Somebody less qualified gets hired over you. That rarely happens. So why the big hoorah? Okay? Affirmative action at its heart. Simple premise. Hire the best person for the job based on the ability to perform the essential functions of the job, regardless of the person's gender, race, accent, national origin, religion, disability, hair color, physical attractiveness, whether they go to your church or belong to your country club, whether they play your favorite sport, whether they are a relative, etc. Okay, but how? So you could simply recognize the talent and how it manifests differently in different people, but that actually takes thought. Thinking is hard work. But you could also see and utilize specific skill sets generated by a particular culture's values, that is culture in the broadest sense, not just ethnicity. But that again requires thinking. Thinking is hard work. So, historically, white women and ethnic minorities experience the most discrimination, and thus, for the purposes of affirmative action, they're called protected classes, and other classes include veterans, disabled, and over 40. So, for example, and this goes to your question, all right? If in a hiring process there is essentially a numeric tie between two equally qualified applicants, so you have to determine that the qualifications in advance. So if there's a tie between two equally qualified applicants and one is a white man, if and only if you are underutilized for that job category can you use affirmative action to break the tie in favor of the protected class person. If the minority or woman is less qualified, you cannot hire them legally. That's illegal. If the tie is between two protected class people, you cannot use affirmative action. Doesn't apply. If the protected class person is better qualified than the white male and you hire the white male, you have illegally discriminated. So, affirmative action only applies if the tie is between the white guy and somebody else. Period.
How would you call that into effect?
Huh?
How would you make that happen, though?
How would you make that happen?
Like how like if there was a tie, how would you ever know? If,
Well, in hiring processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't know. So one of the pieces about, for example, hiring at Lane, and I'm just going to use Lane as a typical place for Oregon. In the 90s during my hire, right? That information about your ethnicity, where you can voluntarily check the box, was supposed to be kept from hiring committees because that was a historical pattern of discrimination. Oh, well, here's a black guy, we'll just throw them out. In fact, in my hire, the way I was coached and recruited by a person of color to come here is they said, it's a paper application process. Your application must be flawless. No mistakes. Fill it out in ink. You include a resume, but everything that's in your resume better be on the application. Flawless, no mistakes. If they see a visual smudge, they will toss your application. That's illegal, but they would do that. Then, that was when we had, a non-human rights professional, human resources professional as the head of human resources. Somebody was somebody's wife. Not necessarily qualified, just inherited the job. So all kinds of illegal stuff was going on, right? So hiring committees were not supposed to see the paper was a tear-off with your ethnicity. So they don't know what your ethnicity is unless you admit it in your materials or they see you in the interview, right? So that's one piece, right? Then there's points. How did you answer this question? Your materials, et cetera, all these things are assigned points. At the end, you go through the interview process. Okay, so let's say you have 7 candidates. My number 1, because I really like this person, because of what they presented, is your number 5. Your number 5 is mine, and vice versa, right? So then you hash it out. Is it raw score? Is it, well, we are really looking for this, we are looking for that, and then, okay. Then affirmative action and human resources, because sometimes they're the same department. Ideally, you want them separated because of checks and balances. You say, okay, we're underutilized for this job category. If you have a tie between these 2 candidates and you're underutilized, you can use it. So for example, I was in a hiring in a department that traditionally hired part-time faculty from the U of O. There were 5 positions open, 7 candidates. The top 4 candidates, interestingly enough, turned out to be the 4 part-timers that came from the University of Oregon that had been working part-time for a number of years. Now before, illegally, if you worked for Lane Community College, you got double points. That's illegal, because you can't give somebody, just because they work for you, that doesn't give them advantage, because you're an equal opportunity employer, right? So everybody has to have an equal chance of getting the job, even your quote-unquote internal candidates. It's illegal to give double points, just because somebody worked for you part-time, for a full-time position. It's illegal to hire somebody from the U of O just because they're from the U of O. You have to have a compelling business interest to hire from the U of O. And there wasn't one. What, convenience? All right, so they hired 4 people from the U of O that were part-timers. Okay, fine. Number 5 and 6 was a white man and an African, within 3 points of each other, numeric points, which is basically, statistically, it's a dead heat. So, okay, we're underutilized for minorities. So here's a place where you can actually let affirmative action take the tie. So I argued, because I was there, because I was brought in by a black manager to actually suspecting some funny things happening with that particular hire. Said, okay. Here, this person, the black person's teaching demonstration was much more difficult. And he conveyed the material accurately and with great student comprehension. So if we're talking like math, he decided, instead everybody did the Pythagorean theorem, he did quadratic equations.
Extra credit.
Yeah, I'd give him extra credit for difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Style points, right? Boom, he got it. Right? So this is the point where we can use affirmative action. Because, you know, the white guy, yeah, well, all right, from the Midwest, he did okay. He did a good Pythagorean theorem. But, you know, I think students would really relate to this person because he's able to convey that. And that prediction was correct. But he left because of other things. Like they're not used to dealing with black people in that department. Lots of departments, actually, but whatever.
How long did he last?
2 years.
We gave it a shot.
Yeah. Well, that was also a department where one of the faculty told, you know, the head of the department, who was also an African, that the reason he resisted his ideas because he was black. One of the UFO PhDs. Okay, so if you're saying stuff like that in the 90s, okay, that's illegal, but, you know, politically a manager's not going to file a complaint against a racist faculty member. Because you're supposed to, like, take it. That's the expectation, right? No.
I don't comprehend that.
Yeah, well, some people don't.
I guess I'm a troublemaker.
Well, yeah. You may be a troublemaker, and, you know, I'm mentioning it, and I'm outing it. I know who it is. The person still works here. Right? So I was asked not to say anything. Now, the person who told me to not say anything is dead now, so now it's just up to me. But I'm just using it as a illustration that that kind of attitude, just because you got a PhD, don't mean you can't make racist comments in a workplace. Okay? So here's the thing, right? This black manager who decided to leave basically is asking the question, why are students having to take algebra 5 times? Because financial aid won't pay for all of it. So we're, as math teachers, we're the ones that teach, and we got it first time every time. Why can't we teach that way so that students learn that way? Basic question. So he said, well, let's implement the algebra project by Bob Moses. Black, Harvard-trained mathematician. You know, you've heard me talk about it, right? So this was the issue that okay, let's hire another African who's competent with math because white students seem to be relating to this guy and developing their math skills, so what's wrong with that? And he seems to be doing it better than y'all, so Why are you tripping?
What happened to you the other week with the committee here at LCC on the gang?
Failed search.
Huh?
Failed search.
What do you mean?
Oh, you mean the gang thing?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't go.
Okay. Well,
That's a whole other thing. We'll get to gangs later. All right. So Euro-American axiology. Specifically, it's epistemology. Counting a measure gives us the popular solution. So take a particular job or job class or family, define a geographical local hiring area, do a demographic analysis of those currently available to do the work as they're represented in the working population, analyze your current workforce, does it resemble local, what are the differences, is there disproportionality, at what point does it occur, advertising, application, screening, hiring. So various tests which prove discrimination, for example, statistical analysis, standard deviations from random chance. 2 standard deviations is the minimum standard. So the reason I'm going through this in terms of looking at hiring, it helps to know if you're applying for a job, who you're up against, so that you can adjust your presentation accordingly. Basic stuff. Better to be over-prepared than not prepared at all. Better to stay ready than to get ready. So I think we talked about this. Yes, do you recall this? I said this verbally Monday, I think, without a slide. But anyway, as an example, local hiring area for us is international. So for example, 30% of foreign language instructors are native speakers. Does your current workforce resemble the local population? So for example, not Spanish. It would be impossible on the West Coast to actually have a lily-white Spanish department. Unless you had, for example, this was that particular department, this was a department chair that has been gone for basically 15 years, but he said, Hispanics don't work out in our department. And he said this to the black affirmative action officer. Black Republican JD affirmative action officer. Wait, you're blatantly discriminating in front of a legal officer of the college, and you're saying that kind of statement, and wow, okay. So the faculty hire I showed you. So discrimination is occurring. So actually it's not 38 African Americans now, it's 40. In all of Lane's history. So that's less than 1 a year.
It's 50 years.
Yeah.
What's wrong with this picture?
So, blacklists. So here's what a blacklist is. I'm redefining blacklist. Just like if Tupac can reclaim nigga, I can reclaim blacklist. So usually a blacklist is a list of people that you don't like for certain reasons. These are a list of groups and organizations and movements for African Americans that emerged in the 20th century, and some existed into the 21st century. Some of them were present, in other words, before the 60s, but all played a prominent role during the struggle. So some of them exist today. And it's not necessarily going to be in alphabetical order, but as I thought about it. So for example, things like African People's Socialist Party, AME, Black Guerrilla Family, Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, CRIPS, NAACP, Nation of Islam, NCOBRA, NMA, NDA, Julius Nyerere, OAU, OAAU, Urban League, US organization. So, for example, and you can actually Google these folks if you wish, or go to their websites. The Uhuru movement, Uhuru means freedom in Kiswahili. African People's Socialist Party, currently led by Omali Yeshitela, one of the few black activist organizations surviving from the 60s, still in effect today. Yeshitela has actually survived numerous assassination attempts, definitely on COINTELPRO, but because, well, you can go visit their site and you can see why by reading their newspaper. But the COINTELPRO efforts were not as effective against them, but the fact, as say with the Black Panthers or us, but most people haven't heard of them. AME, CME. So for example, church was segregated. AME, African Methodist Episcopal, branch of the Christian church founded in the 1700s when blacks weren't allowed into white churches, which was still the case into the 20th century. Colored Methodist Episcopal. Now, Christian Methodist Episcopal, basically the same thing. Black churches, St. Mark's, so CMEs tended to be more conservative, more mainstream assimilationist, non-identification with Africa. St. Mark's, for example, formerly the Ferry Street Chapel on Sam Reynolds Street, is a CME church.
I thought that was mainstream. Is that a mainstream organization?
Yeah. CME?
Yeah, why would they be blacklisted? I mean, I just wonder.
No, they're on there. I'm calling it the blacklist because, as a point of pride, but also because most people aren't aware that there is this infrastructure. So if you're going to talk about what mainstream Black America is, it's composed of a great deal of diversity. These are some of the high points, if you will. Home movies. This is on the list in the syllabus. All Power to the People by Lilu Lee. Story of the Black Panther Party. Ambassador to the Party by Clay Sloan. And the reason I'm making reference to this is because of where we're going next, but I'm still continuing with the blacklist. Both these movies are an interesting study, both when you watch them and the fact that you have never seen them in a theater or on cable.
I would watch that.
So there's an interesting piece in terms of looking at, well, Bastard of the Party was on HBO, but it's not available in video. That's why it's been put up on the internet, which you might argue was now wider access, but why doesn't this get, since it's produced by, essentially Warner Brothers, HBO, Time Warner, why isn't this a product? Well, it's because of the story that it tells, right? So, a bit of history. Just focusing on Los Angeles.